Hi, I'm Sage, and I'm going to be talking about the world of sages in terms of diversity and also medicinal powers. So my plant love story, it is about sage, but it wasn't necessarily about myself. It was about my dad and how when I went off to college, one of our friends gave him a couple of sage plants to take care of, kind of in place of me, and they lived in my bedroom for a little while. But there were two different types of sage, the white sage and the common sage that he was taking care of. And so I was just curious about what's the difference between the types of sages and what other types of sages are out there. So I ended up discovering that there were over 900 species within this salvia genus, which is typically attributed and called sage. This sage is part of the mint family. But as you can see, it's by this tree, it is non-monophyletic. The sages typically are grouped into these separate clades that are separated by and more closely related to other species that are outside of the genus. So for example, this rosmarinus right here, that's rosemary, which is very similar to the common sage. And then this Perovskia genus, it's sometimes called Russian sage. So even though it's not in that salvia genus, it's still by some considered a sage, but the salvia genus is unique in that it has this special pollination method where there are two stamens as opposed to four, and just the structure of the flowers is a little bit unique. Because the sages are non-monophyletic and they're actually quite diverse, there have been people who have thought about splitting up the salvia genus into separate genuses, but with over 900 species, you'd have to rename hundreds of species, and the confusion from that might outweigh, the benefits of having a more cohesive naming system amongst this group. They're geographically diverse. So here we have a couple maps just kind of highlighting one region in which sages tend to appear, and they're found throughout the world. The Mediterranean and Africa have been places of key evolutionary change for sages. And this heat map to the right, it's just comparing the sort of where it's sustainable to grow common sage versus this plant to the left, which is called Greek sage. And this is from a paper in which researchers were hybridizing those two sage species to see what kind of characteristics they can pull from each plant. Because sage has this long history of being a medicinal plant. This quote is attributed to Martin Luther: "Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden?" Because it has pretty wide-ranging positive health effects. So just looking at common sage more from that Mediterranean, Martin Luther European history mindset, it was thought to treat hormonal imbalances, especially in women, regarding menstruation, menopause, things like that. It also aids digestion. It can be a preservative, and is also thought to have positive cognitive benefits. Very similar plant is red sage, which has been more traditionally used in Chinese medicine, even though it also originated in the Mediterranean. And it's been attributed with similar ailments, menopause, menstruation, except for the red sage. The active part of the plant is this tap root that it has this characteristic red color that gives it its name. So kind of the chemicals behind this, very similar between common sage and red sage. I'm just highlighting red sage here. You have antioxidants and anti-inflammatories that do free radical scavenging within the body and reduce oxidative stress that's characteristic to many disease patterns. And notice here that this salvionolic acid on the bottom, it's actually a dimer of the rosmarinic acid shown up above. And these compounds are most concentrated when you have an essential oil from the plant. And common sage is thought to be the sage species that most readily produces an essential oil. And this has been studied recently in a variety of different contexts. This one that I thought was particularly interesting, it was studying common sage treatment for these mice that are induced to have this polycystic ovary syndrome. There are a lot of different issues that come along with this disease, including some fertility issues, which sage has been used for in the past, but it also has a very strong metabolic impact where you have this disorder that makes you more prone to obesity, to diabetes, to insulin resistance. And so they took these mice with the polycystic ovarian syndrome. Half of them just had water, half of them, all their water was replaced with sage tea. And then they measured these different markers of metabolic activity and stress. And you can see from the table on the left, there was a significant reduction in blood glucose level in the sage tea group relative to the non-sage tea group. And then in the middle table, you see that there's a reduction relative to the disease group without tea in the LDLs, HDLs, and then total cholesterol count. And this is visualized in the graph at the right, in which you can see that this total cholesterol count is slightly lower in the PCOS sage tea group than the non-sage tea group. And I thought that this was interesting because unlike other studies where they are focusing on one compound that you can derive from the plant, instead this is a whole plant remedy in which you are likely having some sort of synergistic interactions between the different chemicals. And just to wrap up, I have my sources and a picture of me with my dad.